Okay, good afternoon, British and American culture students. This lecture is on the third quiz. So all this material, when you watch it, remember, on Friday, it's not included on quiz 2. We spent a lot of time talking about the 14th century. Just because we don't have enough time, we had to go through the 15th century very quickly and just kind of skip 100 years and get to the point where there's a crisis in religion and politics and royal personal problems at the same time. Most people, you may not know very many kings, English kings. Certainly everybody knows Queen Elizabeth because she just recently passed away. But amongst people who know English history, perhaps the most well-known king is a man named Henry VIII. So there's a lot of Henrys, 8. I mentioned Henry II and how important he was. But Henry VIII sort of lived during a critical time in English history and European history, which, given his unique personality, created a sort of moment, an unforgettable reign of an individual who sort of changed the course of history, for better or for worse. So I'm going to talk about 2 things today. One of them is religion, again, but we're going to go into more detail about the religious stuff on Friday after you write the quiz, because I don't want to fill your head with too many more ideas before the quiz is over. Right at the beginning of chapter 3, which is entitled Kings, Queens, and Other Things, the kings and queens, it's kind of a joke because the other things are probably more important. But these people, these kings and queens, known as the Tudors, they've made dramas, they've made plays, they've made stories, they've made TV shows, they've made movies about these people. They just have a very dramatic sort of, again, like Henry II's family, Richard the Lionheart, Prince John, who becomes King John and ends up signing the Magna Carta. Just that family has a lot of problems between each other and with the country. So they're important to how English culture changes. As I said before, the Magna Carta at the time, it was a big deal to make a king admit that he was subject to the law, just like everybody else, and that he could just not do whatever he wanted because he's chosen by God. But it's a slow process to get to the point where Henry VIII has to use Parliament as a sort of counterweight to the religious influence of Rome and the Pope. So let me explain this first. Don't have to remember the dates again, but in 1453, as I said, the 100 Years' War is over, Constantinople falls, the Ottoman Empire begins its rapid rise into expansion and influence over Europe and Africa and the Middle East. It becomes a very powerful empire for hundreds of years. That's 1453 is sort of the looking backwards, the turning point for the Turkish people and the Ottoman Empire and the rise of their influence. In the West, England finally is sort of cut off from all of its French possessions, and it's by the end of the 15th century, the Normans are not identifying as like half Norman and half English. They're English. Their lands and possessions and property in France are gone, and so we don't have this kind of really strong continental investment financially, ethnically, traditionally, linguistically. All of these things start to get cut. So but as I told you, the educated people in England still speak French as a second language, and a lot of them speak Latin. Um, so I'll just say they're in 1453, when they lose everything in France, there's a lot of bitterness, there's a lot of fighting, and the king at the time is Henry VI. And Henry VI is pretty much, he's not a warrior king, he's not a strong leader. In fact, he's like Edward the Confessor. He would rather spend his time meditating and praying and going to church. So he doesn't make a very good king in the medieval period. This is the end of the medieval period, but we're still, societies are still looking for warrior kings, and he is not. So he's got no descendants. He's a Lancaster. There's two families that start fighting with each other. They're called the Yorks, the York family. They're both of these, all of these people are descended from Edward III. So you remember Edward III, his son died, and then Richard II was the boy during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. All of the people who are trying to be king or have a chance at being king are from the 5 sons of Edward III. So as I said at the time, he sort of started the 100 Years' War, made a big 100-year-long war with France, and he had too many sons. So sometimes the problem is there's no sons, so we have no king. Now we've got lots of princes all over the place. Which one is going to be? So long story short, there's a war that goes back and forth between these two houses, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. It's called the War of the Roses. And if you know the series Game of Thrones, it's an HBO. It's an HBO series with like 7 seasons, but there's a series of books, and those books are they're not historical, but they're based on the fact that there was all these different princes claiming to be descended, and there was a real bloodline, just like the Derenice line, the Targaryens. If you watch this, it's an amazing series. If you like fantasy and you like historical stuff, there's a lot of magic and fantasy involved in it, but part of it is based on real events in England, where there was about 30 years of different houses and factions fighting over who would become the king. In the end, let's just say, there's a play called Richard III, and Richard III fights against Henry Tudor, and in the battle, for various reasons, Richard III loses, and he's cut down on his horse, and in Shakespeare's play, his crown rolls off his head under a hawthorn bush, and then Henry Tudor picks it up and puts it on his head, and he's the new king of England by blood. This is a problem, obviously, because for the last few hundred years of English kings, usually the king gets killed rather than dying and having his son succeed him, or somebody a relative succeed him, peacefully. Every time, a king, there's a change in the king, the current king dies mysteriously or in battle or something. It's a very violent time. So most of the English kings die, including Richard III. And then Henry Tudor actually isn't closely related to the Lancaster line. That's why he's called a Tudor, because actually some of his family, or half of his family, is Welsh. They're not even English. But nonetheless, Richard III is unpopular enough that Henry VII gets the support of most of the English nobility, and he becomes the king. That happens in 1485, and that's the end of the War of the Roses. He rules for a good 30 years. He marries the sister of the York king, Edward IV. Her name is Elizabeth of York. It really gets confusing in this class because everybody's Henry, Edward, Richard, or Elizabeth or Mary. But yeah, the most important Elizabeths and Marys are still coming. So, try and keep them straight. Don't worry about these Marys and Elizabeths because they're not that significant. But Henry VII marries Elizabeth of York, and that brings the Lancaster and York families together, which should end the fighting. And it does. Henry VII kind of unifies the country again. He's very frugal. He's not much of a hunter or a warrior. But that doesn't matter because he's a very skilled politician. So what he does is he gets his first son, and you will understand why he has a first son named Arthur, because that's a lucky name. That's the mythological hero who sort of created England as a country, right? So he names his first son Arthur, and he needs allies, he needs friends. He doesn't have a lot of money. Obviously the French, not that they've just been fighting for hundreds of years, so they're not really good friends, but he manages to settle by marrying a daughter to the French prince, and they make a settlement, and he actually gets some money from the French, and they're at peace. And he does this with most of the countries, and with Spain, he arranges for his first son to marry the princess of the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. If you don't know who those people are, those are the people that commissioned Columbus on his voyage to the New World. Okay, that's that Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. These are this is the king and queen who presided over the unification, Reconquista of Spain. Like, Spain became, under their rule, Spain became unified. They defeated the last Muslim province and expelled them from the Iberian Peninsula. So a lot of things happened during their life. These are big events. So by having Arthur, and England's kind of in the corner, out of the way, a not important country at this time, Henry VII manages to achieve this great diplomatic marriage arrangement. It's great for England because Spain looked like England like 15 years before, but now they've defeated the Muslims. They've unified. There's like 5 kingdoms in Spain, but Spain is essentially unified under these two co-monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand. And Columbus has found some kind of interesting new world that's starting to produce all these different resources and possibilities and trade routes to Asia. So all of a sudden, like, he basically got super lucky there. Spain is suddenly not that interested in being connected to England, but it doesn't matter because it's too late. However, Arthur dies, and Ferdinand tries to say, well, send her back, since we agreed to marry your first son, so give her back and give back the money. And Henry says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep your daughter, and I have another son. He's much younger, but he can marry her instead. And they negotiate and stuff, but basically Catherine's stuck in England and Henry has the money, so Ferdinand doesn't have really much bargaining power there. So Henry ends up marrying Catherine of Aragon, which is probably there's quite a few marriages. I mean, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, you might argue, at least as important as this one. But this is normally the most fateful marriage in the history of the English monarchy. I think Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine would be a close second, if not first. But in doing this, Henry marries Catherine of Aragon, who's she's now basically the princess of the Spanish Empire. All of a sudden, Spain is not like a country sort of in a civil war, trying to reclaim territory, fighting against Muslim provinces, but it's actually sort of the mother, the home base of rapidly expanding ocean empire. And in the next 100 years, it'll become the richest, most powerful, empire in the world. Um, so Catherine is Spanish, and she's pretty popular. Henry VIII, like I said, quite a bit younger than her, almost 10 years younger than her. But they seem to have got along pretty well. And he did it for diplomatic, political reasons, not because of love or because of anything else. So not really a sense of duty, but just because this was the best thing for the kingdom. And Henry was always concerned, really, about himself and the power of his kingdom, because that represented him. I think Henry's got to be one of the most selfish, narcissistic individuals in English history. But he thought that, just like I said, the body politic is the body of the king is the kingdom. They're the same thing. So if England's powerful, he's powerful, and if he's powerful, England is powerful. So he was good. He was an athlete. He was good at tennis. He spoke 5 languages. I believe it was English, Spanish, French, Italian, and Latin. Supposedly, I mean, he was a composer. He wrote some organ music for the church. When Martin Luther started the Reformation, Henry VIII wrote sort of theological refutation of what Martin Luther had written, criticizing his opinion on a spiritual and like a religiously philosophical basis. So incredibly intelligent person. When he was young, he was handsome and tall, and the expectations were high. I mean, Henry VII, let's say, he stabilized the kingdom. He saved a lot of money. He was very careful with his spending. He didn't cheat on his wife. He went to church all the time. He was very dedicated Catholic. He was a great king in a lot of ways, but not flashy or exciting or inspiring or medieval. He was sort of like a bureaucrat. He was more like a CEO. You know what I mean? He just managed the company very well, but he wasn't like out there making people scream and making people excited and stuff like that. Henry VIII used to travel around and party and spend other people's money, obviously, stay at wealthy people's castles with all his retainers and his friends, and gamble and drink and play. But he would go around and let the people, he would go into cities and towns and sort of go process through the town and let everybody see him, because you got to remember, this is a time where there's no newspapers, right? There's no media or anything like that. And I think this is a big difference between the way that the kings and queens in England behaved compared to not just, Asian kings and queens, and every country has different things, like Chinese emperors, sort of lived in the Forbidden Palace and nobody ever saw them, and things like that. And to a certain extent, I think the Korean kings, didn't associate with peasants or low-level people or serfs or farmers or townspeople. They would, only be exposed to the wealthy, politically connected, influential people. That this is something that the kings and queens of England, and to be honest, I think there's European countries that are the same. I'm not just saying Asian countries sort of sequestered their leaders. It's something like they did in France too. If you saw the King of France in the Palace of Versailles, that's because you were an important person. The people, the regular French people living in the provinces would never ever get even close, 100 kilometers away. But the kings and queens of England, right back to Henry II, right back to Henry I. Henry I is the son of William the Conqueror. This is 1,000 years ago. These kings and queens went out, traveled all the time. They didn't stay in London all the time. They traveled around to the cities and villages, the cathedrals, and towns. They went to France. They went to Normandy. That's sort of the reason why a lot of the French, until the Hundred Years' War, a lot of the people in Normandy and Aquitaine and Poitiers and Anjou, they liked the English. I mean, they liked the French speaking rich English because they actually appeared and they knew who they were and they had some sense of who they were fighting for. But when the Hundred Years' War started, Edward III and the other kings after him, when they were attacking, they used to attack the French peasants and take their food and take their land and just trample across everything. And the French people didn't like that. And so the attitude changed. Henry VII didn't fight any wars. His whole reign, because of all the problems, the loss of the Hundred Years' War and all of the Civil War and the War of the Roses, the government didn't have any money, and he wanted to correct that. So he leveled off the taxes, and he made peace with people, and he increased trade, and he reformed the tax code and everything. He increased the income of the royal government by about 25%. And he reduced spending because the most expensive thing is fighting a war, and he didn't do that. Henry VIII, unfortunately, inherits this stable kingdom with a stable budget. It's not a rich country, but it's not losing money. England is not poor anymore. It's got a balanced budget. And Henry VIII inherits the situation, but he doesn't want to. When he's in his 20s, he just wants to play. He wants to hunt and travel and hang out with girls and play sports, compose music, and enjoy himself. He doesn't want to do the government stuff. So he has some important people work for him, manage the country for him, sort of just like Henry II and Becket. He has a guy named Cardinal Wolsey. Cardinal Wolsey is the Archbishop of York, not Canterbury. But he is a sort of managerial genius. His father was a butcher. So this is an example. The chain of being, like I said, way back at the beginning of chapter 2, it's the great chain of being is starting to fall apart. The Black Death is something that is very disruptive to that chain because so many people die and the chain is kind of missing pieces to it. So, people move around. This is pretty remarkable, though, that this man, he ends up going to Oxford on a poor boys scholarship. So specifically, Oxford lets in a few poor people. This is something that the national universities in Korea do now. It's related to being disadvantaged compared to you may not have the highest grades, but you don't have access to education. So maybe people from the countryside or people who are too poor are allowed to go to the university for free. They get a scholarship, or they just get accepted, maybe. So this poor boy scholarship works like that. Oxford finds the most, the poor young men with the most potential, and they get a scholarship and they don't have to pay it, which normally doesn't make you jump into the aristocracy, but Wolsey is an incredibly intelligent and talented person. So after he gets his education at Oxford, as I told you, you got really two choices here. If you really want to move up significantly in status, you're joining the military or you're joining the church. He joins the church. He's very gifted with language and with speech, and as sort of a lawyer and a judge, he's very logical and very well studied. He's got a great memory. He makes his way up the ranks until he's a bishop, and then he gets appointed as the Archbishop of York, and then he becomes a cardinal, which means he's, one level below the Pope. And he's the papal legate. So even though there's an archbishop in Canterbury, Wolsey is in some ways more important than the highest ranking priest in England, because he's got a direct line to the Pope. So he's the papal legate, he's a cardinal, he's a higher rank than even the most powerful priest in England. So he's like an international priest sort of thing. Once you're a cardinal, you get the red hat. And when there's a new pope, you get to vote and all that kind of stuff. He was hoping probably to be the second English pope, because there'd only been one, and there still has only been one English pope. He was very ambitious, and while King Henry was young, Cardinal Wolsey, this is his name, he ran the country for 10 years. He had he had multiple titles. He was the bishop at several cathedrals, and he was a cardinal, and he was the Archbishop at York, but he used to stay in London. So basically he had 4 jobs, but he was only doing one, and he was getting paid for 4. He was managing also, he was the chancellor, so he was managing the royal government. Apparently he was making something like £30,000 a year, where the entire royal government was making 100,000. So that would mean that he was making about 30% of the entire revenue of a government. So this is an outrageous amount. This is more than Elon Musk's make. This would be like Elon Musk making $7 trillion a year, right? Because the GDP of the United States is like $30 trillion. 30% of that is something like $9 trillion. This is how much money this guy was making proportionately to the government. 30% of the government's revenue. That's an outrageous amount. I can't even imagine how much power this person had. Nonetheless, Henry VIII was not the type of person to care how much money or influence a person had. So Henry VIII is known for several things. First, all of the things I said. He's very active, he's very intelligent, he was young and ambitious. He was a very, very strong-willed person and very decisive. And if you got in his way, you were done. If you were on the wrong side of an argument, or you had some loyalties that were not to him, you're either going to jail or you're going to be executed. Often it was execution. So this guy, Wolsey, inevitably, at a certain point, ran out of luck. And although he managed the country very well, he had amassed too much power, and sort of made Henry VIII jealous at a certain point, because some people were saying, well, it's not the king that runs the country, it's this cardinal named Wolsey. So Henry VIII decided to reassert himself, and he accused Wolsey of some trumped up crimes, which he didn't really do. He accused him of being loyal to the Pope rather than the king. And any Catholic priest is obviously loyal to the Pope as much as he is to the king. So it's true. You just don't charge people with that, because that's all Catholic churches. They have split allegiance. They have to follow the king, and they have to follow the Pope as the leader of the Catholic Church. They have 2 obligations. And if those come into conflict, they have to make a decision. He's accused of being loyal to the Pope over the king. So he has to stand trial. He's guilty. He has to retire. He wants to get back into politics because he misses all the power and the money and the influence. And he tries to do that, and then he gets caught, and he dies on his way to his second trial. So Wolsey dies, and he builds these magnificent palaces. I'll show you on Friday a picture of a Hamilton Place, which is one of the the spectacular palaces that Wolsey built. And when he died, Henry just took control of it. So Henry ends up marrying Catherine. She's much older than him. They try to have children. They have a baby girl. Her name is Mary. Henry's okay with that. Next time, maybe we'll get a boy, because that's what we need. They try again and again, and they have several boys, but the boys die within a month. And they have some stillborn babies. And then Catherine is 40 years old, and it looks like she's not going to be able to have another child. It's been 6 or 7 years since the last, miscarriage. So they try, they fail. Henry needs to have a boy, and so he decides that the only thing he has to do it, even though he doesn't want to, really, is to divorce Catherine. This is the most famous divorce in English history, obviously, partly because Catherine was supposed to marry Arthur, and then they basically did get married, and then he died right away. So now Henry's saying, because basically the Pope had to say, oh, the marriage didn't count. He had to give a dispensation to say, oh, the marriage between Arthur and Catherine doesn't count. You can marry Henry, it's okay. Now Henry's going to say, no, it actually did count. So my marriage to Catherine is not real, not legitimate, not legal. And so he presents this case to the Pope. But Catherine's parents are the king and queen of France. King and queen of Spain, and she's also related. Her uncle is the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, who rules like Central Europe. These people have way more power and influence over the Pope. So when Henry says, I want a divorce because I need to have another queen, because I need to have another kid, the Pope says no. They decide to have a court case, and they send a representative from Rome. There's a cardinal that comes, and they have a case, and they argue it. And then they argue for a year. Catherine says her side of the story. I never consummated the marriage. It's not real. It's not true. She defends herself. They decide to suspend the court because it's summer in Italy, and during the summer it's too hot. And Henry realizes this isn't going to work. The case is going to go back to Rome. They're never going to agree with me because Catherine's uncle and her parents are very important people in the Catholic Church and in their kings and queens in Europe. So they're not going to win. So he gives up, and he decides to separate the church. He decides to make a Church of England. It's called the Act of Supremacy, where there's the act of restraint, and there's the act of supremacy. There's several decrees, basically laws that go through the English Parliament, and the English Parliament has to agree with this. This is important because although Henry VIII is very powerful and he's a tyrant and he's strong, and he could just scare people and kill people until he wants people to do what he wants. Instead, he proposes the act. He runs the act through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and Parliament votes to support it. So although it's his idea and his proposal, him and his current Chancellor Thomas Cromwell, they have this proposal. It's approved and given legitimacy by the Parliament. This is important because 100 years later, Parliament's going to feel like the king has to have its approval. So Parliament passes these acts, which make it makes England an empire, which is an imperium. No other outside power has the ability to command English people. So the Pope is no longer able to tell the Catholics what to do, even though they're English. This is sort of cutting the legal authority of the Catholic Church in England. They're declaring it an empire, and They're giving the responsibility of all the powers of the Pope to the king, making Henry VIII the head of the English church. And that's the Reformation. That's the English Reformation. It has a lot to do with his divorce, but we will talk about this. I will review this a little bit on Friday, but basically, the first reason, the ostensible reason here is Henry VIII wants to divorce Catherine so that he can marry Anne Boleyn. And then Anne Boleyn is going to have, she's going to give him a child named Elizabeth, which she's going to become very famous, as you know. But when she is born, he is super disappointed because he wants a boy. Then she finds out she's making fun of him, and their relationship breaks down, and he accuses Anne of cheating on him, and then he kills her. So that's wife number 2, gets her head chopped off. Wife number 1, divorced. Just before Anne of Boleyn gets her head cut off, Catherine dies of natural causes, just diseases and ill health. Anne gets her head cut off. She has Elizabeth, so Elizabeth is a baby. And then he goes for wife number 3, Jane Seymour, and she has a baby boy. Finally, he gets a boy, but then she dies 2 weeks later of an infection. So then he has to go for wife number 4 and 5 and 6, but there's no more children. That's why Henry VIII is so famous, because of all the wife drama, I should say, not drama. First reason, to make the English church, to have the Reformation in England. Divorce Catherine. Second reason, power. Now he doesn't have to listen to the Pope anymore. He always hated listening to other people. He's a narcissistic, selfish psychopath. You can probably think of some other world leaders who have the same kind of personality. He doesn't like other people having authority over him. Now he has authority over the state and the religion, doesn't have to listen to anybody except himself. That's something that Henry VIII really enjoys and pretty much needs for his own sanity or insanity. Third thing, the wealth of the church. Both him and his buddy, Thomas Cromwell, who's a Protestant, he's sort of the arch nemesis of Thomas More, and we'll talk about Thomas More as a sort of representative of a stoic Catholic martyr hero. Thomas Cromwell is probably the one who drew it. Well, he's not probably. He's the one who organized the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Restraint, making English an autonomous imperial state that didn't have any outside authority being recognized, and making the English church, making Henry VIII the head of the English church as the person who has the power to make all the decisions in the institution of the church. He's also the one that expected about 25% of the land in England was owned by the church, especially the good land. So the chances are, if you're an English person, you're either working on church land or there was church land. Church was your neighbor, and the land beside you belonged to the church. There's church land everywhere. Some of it is monasteries, some of it is rented, some of it is agriculture, some of it is forest, some of it is natural, sort of like parks. Some of it has buildings on it, right? Some of it has cloisters and abbeys, cathedrals, small churches, parishes, that kind of thing. Okay, there's all kinds of different buildings in church. Now, the church is very wealthy. They have a lot of, precious metal in the form of plates and cups and decorations and expensive clothing, artwork, buildings, land, produce, all kinds of goods, all kinds of productive land, and all kinds of different wealth. If and when they took possession of, they changed it to the Church of England. They were going to evaluate, which they did. They evaluated all of the monasteries in England, and they confiscated all of that wealth for the state. For the state. So all of that land and all of that wealth became property of the crown, which Henry VIII has control of. So I will tell you on Friday what he did with that. But it's not just because he needs to divorce his wife. There's three other really important reasons. The authority of having power over the spiritual and the political. The officially making a divorce, legitimate without the Pope's approval, and the wealth of the church that they could take possession of and use for their own reasons. And we'll stop there. Now you know a little bit about the Tudors. I'll flesh out the picture on Friday, and I'll show you sort of a picture of what Hamilton Place looks like. And then we'll talk about the Reformation and what that means, the split in Christianity, the greatest split, which leaves various new types of Christianity opposed to Catholicism, and we'll talk about, after Henry VIII dies, we'll talk about Mary and Elizabeth. First Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Okay. I'll see you on Friday for the quiz. Make sure you bring a device to class so you can do your quiz. Have a good day.